March 23, 1989, a 50-million-ton asteroid came within only 400,000 miles of Earth, a distance considered to be dangerously close. Designated 1989 FC, it joined a growing list of Earth-threatening asteroids. Considering this asteroid's enormous size, a collision with Earth would have been catastrophic. In measurable terms, its impact on land would have erased a city the size of New York in seconds.
A few million at most would die in the impact event itself, but billions would die as a result of the climatological side effects of an impact.
The global consequences? Clouds of dust and debris would have been catapulted into the atmosphere, blocking the sun's light and ending life as we know it.
1989 FC was one that passed very close to the Earth, about 500,000 miles from the Earth, about a little over a week before it was discovered. So that's a little frightening that something came by and you didn't see it. It was coming from the direction of the sun, so it's reasonable that we didn't see it coming. On the other hand, just a little bit frightening.
Asteroids can be viewed only in the night sky. Thus, 1989 FC, which approached from the sun, escaped early detection by the world's telescopes.
The asteroids are the leftover bits and pieces from the inner solar system formation process. So when the planets formed, including Earth, the leftover bits and pieces, the chunks of rock and metal that were not incorporated in the planets themselves, remained as the asteroids.
In 1989, the Earth dodged a bullet, but a virtual outer space pinball effect is constantly at play.
Over the 4.5 billion years of solar system history, those bodies collided with each other, fragmenting each other, producing what we now call the asteroid belt. Every once in a while, fragments of those asteroids will get ejected from the asteroid belt and then visit other parts of the solar system, and occasionally they run into Earth.
NEAs, or near-Earth asteroids, as the name implies, are asteroids that can come close to the Earth and once in a long while can collide with the Earth. Most of them, we think, come from the main asteroid belt, although some of them could be dead comets. The ones that come from the main asteroid belts have been ejected from that belt by the gravitational effect of Jupiter.
Asteroids are classified as NEAs if their orbits come within 121 million miles of the sun. They are considered potentially hazardous if they sweep within 3 million miles of the Earth. Earth-asteroid collisions are more than speculation. One asteroid in particular changed the course of Earth's history in spectacular fashion. For over 150 million years, dinosaurs roamed the Earth. With awesome size and fearsome strength, they were the dominant creatures on the planet. But in a geological blink of an eye, their reign ended.
65 million years ago, a large, probably asteroidal body hit the Earth and wiped out most of the species of life on Earth, including dinosaurs. That's particularly important for humankind since human beings came about after a long evolutionary process that started with the demise of the dinosaurs and the rise of small squirrel-like mammals. So we are here because of an asteroid impact.
In 1980, scientist Luis Alvarez and his son Walter discovered that a layer of asteroid dust existed right at the KT boundary, the geological division between the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods, when the dinosaurs became extinct. Astronomers and geologists quickly endorsed the prospect of a dinosaur-killing asteroid. Others, citing little proof of an impact, disagreed. But then, scientists tracked the asteroid dust back to its source and found the impact site, the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
The KT boundary crater is also called the Chicxulub impact crater, and it's named for a small Maya town in the center of the structure, which translates roughly to tail of the devil, which seems appropriate for a dinosaur-killing event.
The Chicxulub crater, it's a something like 200-kilometer diameter crater structure, but you can't see it. If you fly over the place, it's just the edge of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's it. The crater itself is buried underneath the Yucatan Peninsula.
Scientists estimated that to create an impact crater the size of Chicxulub, an asteroid would have to be between 6 and 12 miles wide.
When it hit the surface of the Earth, it exploded with the energy equivalent to about 100 trillion tons of TNT. And all of this debris was ejected out of the crater. A lot of it went far above the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, some of it went halfway to the moon before it fell back and reaccreted to the Earth. And it's that debris that scientists have been tracking around the entire globe.
The cloud formed by this debris would have lasted for months, blocking the sun's light and leading to the extinction of most of the plants and animals on Earth, including dinosaurs. Could another extinction event be in our future?
It's not a matter of if an impact is going to occur again, it's when it's going to occur again. And eventually we are going to have an impact as large as the KT boundary impact occur again here on Earth.
Countless asteroids have already hit the Earth, yet the planet's surface is remarkably devoid of the signature impact craters.
If you look at the moon and look at that cratered face, you really should take that cratered picture and put it right on the surface of the Earth, because that is a good and much better representation of what has actually happened to our planet. On our planet, however, we have all of these active geologic processes like erosion, like volcanism, which can bury craters.
Arizona's meteor crater, however, has remained virtually unaltered since being formed some 50,000 years ago, when an asteroid 50 yards across, half the size of a football field, slammed into the Earth. The impact produced a crater nearly 600 feet deep and over 4,000 feet across.
It is in pristine condition, and part of that is because of its relatively young age. It also occurred in what is now largely an arid environment, so we do not have a lot of erosion, which has been a fantastic scientific boon because we can still study it.
Spurred on by the increasing evidence that the Earth is subject to continued bombardment from space, astronomers set out to find these asteroids before they hit. By the 1980s, the innovative combination of a charged coupled device, or CCD camera, and a telescope proved invaluable in discovering new asteroids.
The CCD cameras are much more sensitive than either the naked eye or the photographic plate, and images on them can be analyzed automatically rather than by eye, which one had to do with photographic plates.
These electronic detection systems are able to identify asteroids much faster than people looking at photographs. Their findings are dramatic, in fact, earth-shattering. They prove the Earth exists in a swarm of celestial missiles that could destroy the planet. Astronomers estimate that there are approximately 2,500 asteroids that fit into the Earth killer category, and they speculate that one of these may reach the Earth in 2028. Will this be Armageddon? And if we are on a collision course with an asteroid, is there anything we can do to stop it? Millions of years ago, a giant asteroid wiped out the Earth's dinosaurs. Then, in 1997, a scientist alarmed the world with news that history may repeat itself.
On December 6, 1997, I was actually hunting for a comet that was coming back from the depths of space, hoping to recover the comet. I didn't see the comet that night, unfortunately. But during the course of the scan, I found an asteroid that had rates of motion that told me it had to be a near-Earth asteroid.
An ad hoc team of professional and amateur astronomers around the world began tracking the asteroid designated 1997 XF11 and calculating its orbit.
We went through the calculation and it stopped our computer. It stopped the computer because the calculation indicated it was too close. It showed a distance of only 30,000 miles on October the 26th, 2028.
Dr. Marsden released the results of his orbital calculations on the internet, claiming that 1997 XF11 was virtually certain to come closer to the Earth than the distance of the Moon. But as astronomers had only 3 months to observe the asteroid, their calculations proved premature. Just one day after 1997 XF11 was front-page news, scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, calculated a new, more precise orbit for the asteroid. They concluded the asteroid would miss the Earth by at least 600,000 miles. Doomsday forecasts were quickly recanted, and the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Still, uncertainty over asteroids remains.
Once every 100,000 or 200,000 years, an asteroid as large as a good-sized mountain, a kilometer or a mile across, will hit the Earth. We know that that's going to happen statistically. We know that there will be a large impact with the Earth, and if steps are not taken to avert it, that impact will do immense damage to the biosphere, to all living things on Earth.
Though it sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie, there are actual plans to divert a threatening asteroid. One is to send a huge parabolic mirror into orbit to direct the sun's lethal rays toward the asteroid, vaporizing it. Another approach is to push an oncoming asteroid out of Earth's way via rockets. And even more imaginative, to launch solar sails to catch the pressure of solar wind, slowing an asteroid and causing it to change orbit.
All you have to do is nudge the asteroid just a bit, just a few millimeters per second. And so in 30 years' time, that little tiny nudge, as the asteroid goes around and around and heads for the Earth, is just enough so that the asteroid will actually miss rather than hit the Earth.
Somewhere out there, a huge rock is headed toward Earth. The means to divert or destroy this asteroid may exist somewhere between Hollywood's next screenplay and a long-sought scientific solution. Until our defenses are in place, we live in the asteroid's shadow, watching the night skies and waiting. Within our solar system, one planet continues to capture the imagination and tease us with possibility. Its history's greatest mystery: is there life on Mars? August 7th, 1996, NASA Administrator Dan Golden called a press conference to announce an earth-shaking discovery. Contained within a potato-sized meteorite just might be scientific evidence of life on Mars. Even America's commander-in-chief at the time weighed in on the 4-pound rock.
Today, Rock 84001 speaks to us across all those billions of years and millions of miles. It speaks of the possibility of life. If this discovery is confirmed, it will surely be one of the most stunning insights into our universe that science has ever uncovered.
Isn't it a kick to live in times when we're discussing this as people? You know, rocks from Mars, maybe life. Let's go find out. Ooh.
These are indeed heady times in the history of humankind's fascination with Mars. In fact, we've learned more in the last 35 years than we have in the past 3,500. Humans have held a curiosity with the red planet as far back as the ancient Egyptians. But it was not until 1877 that astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli sparked the imagination of the world for the next half-century.
Italian astronomer Schiaparelli was the one who really emphasized the idea that there were channels on Mars, that there were these markings, these long linear markings on Mars.
And the trouble was, if you call it trouble, that Schiaparelli reported that Mars's surface had canali.
And of course, those of us speaking English immediately think canals, and when we think canals, we think of boats. And so there was the notion of a civilization implied by the use of this word, which wasn't necessarily intentioned.
Still, Schiaparelli's theory remained virtually unknown until an enterprising amateur astronomer named Percival Lowell, using one of the most sophisticated telescopes in the world, reported that he was observing and cataloging 183 canals, 4 times more than Schiaparelli observed 20 years before.
The only problem was he added all these features which we now know are not correct because of the human tendency, the eye and brain working together, to see lines where there are only fuzzy dots.
At the turn of the 20th century, Lowell's scientific papers were considered groundbreaking.
Well, Lowell was such a good salesman for his ideas, for his visions, that almost everybody simply assumed that there was life on Mars. The big debate was whether or not there was higher life, whether or not there was Martians.
Ironically, while the public bought into the Martian myth, scientists learned some sobering facts. Between 1925 and 1950, astronomers discovered that the Martian atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide and that the nighttime temperature could reach 200 degrees below zero. Pop culture kept the dream of life on Mars alive until November 28, 1964, when audiences tuned in to a real-life Martian TV show. The 6-year-old National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, launched Mariner 4, the first Mars probe to successfully fly by the Red Planet. On July 14, 1965, Mariner 4 snapped 21 black and white images. 5,000 years of speculation was about to come to an end.
You kind of think it's going to look a little familiar. Instead, it was this barren, harsh, cratered world.
We were very disappointed. There was no linear feature. There was no evidence of water on the planet.
And overnight, this vision of Mars as a kind of a friendly, maybe a little rough, but friendly planet had to evaporate to a world that was much more like our moon.
In short order, Martians were passé. But NASA pressed on. On November 14, 1971, Mariner 9 became the first spacecraft to successfully orbit Mars and transmitted more than 7,000 photos.
There were channels, maybe closer to Schiaparelli. They weren't straight, they were kind of wiggly, but they looked like maybe water had flowed in them.
So the prospect that there had been liquid water at the surface greatly increased the real possibility that there could have been life at one time.
In 1976, spacecrafts Viking 1 and 2 did something new. They landed on Mars in a search for signs of life. When their experiments turned up empty, the mission was deemed a failure. But in another of the historic pendulum swings between science fact and fantasy, a few pictures from the Viking orbiters sent the life on Mars debate in a new, bizarre direction.
We were taking very detailed pictures of the surface early in the Viking mission to try and select the landing sites. And we were amused by one of these pictures. We could see something that looked kind of like a face.
What NASA saw as an amusing fluke, others saw as evidence of a Martian civilization capable of engineering the largest sculpture in the universe.
The face on Mars became an iconic figure. Many people claim, by God, that is a face, and therefore, if there's a face a mile across, it proves A, that an intelligent civilization exists, and B, their faces look a lot like our faces.
The official explanation was that the face was produced by a trick of light and shadow. To test that theory, independent image enhancement engineer Dr. Mark Carlotto built a computer model showing the face under different lighting conditions.
What these results showed was that the facial features, instead of disappearing, actually persisted over a very wide range of conditions. And this suggested to me that it was not an optical illusion.
Additional pictures from the area around the face, a region known as Cydonia, were offered as further proof that the face was a Martian engineering model. The collection of pyramidal shapes became known as the Cydonian Complex.
This suggested the possibility that there was a bigger picture here, not just an isolated formation that happened to look like a humanoid face, but a set of objects nearby that may have been a place where the people who built the face could have lived.
NASA's skeptical reaction to the face on Mars was seen by Mars believers as a full-blown government conspiracy. It would be 20 years before another Mars expedition photographed the Cydonian complex and the infamous face. Would these new photographs be the smoking gun that solved the mystery of the face once and for all? In 1975, photos of what appeared to be a face on Mars stirred up fantastic notions of civilizations living on the Red Planet. The 1996 announcement of a meteorite containing Martian organic compounds renewed public interest in Mars. Mars Global Surveyor took off just 4 months after the meteorite press conference and began sending back new, higher-resolution images. 8 months later, on July 4, 1997, Mars Pathfinder was the first space probe to land on the Red Planet in more than 2 decades. Sojourner, a 6-wheeled miniature rover, captivated a television audience larger than the one that watched the moon landing in 1969. Then, in 1998, Global Surveyor returned to Cydonia and re-photographed the infamous Mars face.
When you look at the higher resolution photos, I think that no unbiased observer can see a face. Instead, you see that there are some interesting rock formations that from the right angle might suggest a face.
But the new pictures didn't convince everyone that the Mars face was merely a coincidental rock formation.
Global Surveyor saw the face illuminated from below, kind of like holding a flashlight under your chin on Halloween, so the image was very distorted geometrically. It looked nothing like the Viking image.
Ultimately, the face on Mars is in the eye and mind of the beholder.
People are welcome to look them up on the internet and see what these new images look like, and they sure look like a coincidence. And it's kind of sad because, you know, in both my scientific work and my fictional work, I love aliens. But you gotta have some skepticism too.
The possibility of life on Mars continues to tantalize.
I think we need to know a lot more about the cosmos that we inhabit. There are a lot of ways to do that, but Mars is actually within reach.
Is life there at all? We don't know. It's that question that we're after.
The government has a history of distorting its involvement in UFO investigations. Information about sightings has been suppressed, altered, even fabricated. Just what is the government trying to keep secret? UFO believers say their distrust in the government has its roots in a bizarre incident that occurred during World War II. In 1942, shortly after the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, radar stations in California picked up signals from unidentified aircraft approaching Los Angeles from the sea.
The Los Angeles air alarm, as it's become known, of February 1942, is very impressive because a number of unidentified aircraft were seen, including one quite large one.
The city was blacked out. Searchlights scanned the skies. Anti-aircraft batteries were manned for action.
The Americans considered that they were being invaded by the Japanese because only a night or so before a Japanese submarine had attacked the Los Angeles coastline.
Eyewitnesses reported that the mysterious air armada was immune to the exploding shells. The aircraft hovered over the city for about an hour. Then they slipped away as silently as they came.
At least 1 million people witnessed these events. 1,430 rounds of ammunition were fired at the objects. Nothing was brought down.
In the wake of the action, there were 3 deaths from heart attacks and damage to private property, all from friendly fire. The incident made the front page of the Los Angeles Times.
It's popularly believed that the government and the military suppressed this. Now, in fact, no such thing happened. I mean, the story ran in the papers the following day.
An inquiry launched by the Navy attributed the action to wartime jitters, claiming the Army fired at an empty sky. The Army, as confirmed in recently declassified documents, disagreed, insisting that something extraordinary happened that night in L.A., something that may never be explained.
Certainly from a UFO standpoint, there was no need for them to cover it up because it was unprecedented. But clearly it was embarrassing to have to admit the existence of unexplained vehicles of unknown origin invading United States airspace over a major city.
As the Cold War began to heat up, sightings took on a more sinister aspect. Fear of a nuclear holocaust translated into fear of the unknown. UFO reports by ordinary Americans increased dramatically. The U.S. government felt a sense of urgency to prevent the sightings from spreading into mass hysteria.
And you really have to understand that the CIA was very, very concerned about the Soviet Union and their capabilities. Unless you understand that relationship, you cannot understand the UFO phenomena.
In September 1964, at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, Lieutenant Robert Jacobs, a photographic officer, filmed a routine missile test flight. A few days later, Jacobs screened the footage for his superiors.
clearly visible was a disc-shaped craft which flew around the Atlas missile, which was flying at thousands of miles an hour by this time.
Jacobs later described the astonishing scene. We saw a UFO swim into the picture, distinct and clear. It circled our missile, emitting vivid flashes of light, then vanished. Seconds later, our missile malfunctioned and tumbled out of control in the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles short of its target. Jacobs was sworn to secrecy. The film was turned over to two men he was certain were CIA agents. Jacobs remained silent until 1982, when he came forward to accuse the Air Force and CIA of a cover-up.
He decided to come out with the story. People who then investigated his background were told that he'd never been at Vandenberg Air Force Base, he never held the position of officer in charge of filming and so forth.
Without his military record and the telltale film, Jacobs was unable to prove that his story was true. Media interest quickly evaporated.
By being so secretive about UFOs, not only did the CIA undermine its own credibility with UFO researchers, it gave the public further reason to question the necessity of national security secrecy.
Sometimes, suspected government interference gets very personal and menacing. A police chief in rural Alabama found his life turned upside down after a face-to-face encounter with a possible alien. Since the 1940s, UFO buffs have accused the government of covering up UFO sightings. In some cases, they may have done more than just cover up. The most dramatic example of suspected government interference in a UFO sighting happened in Alabama in 1973. Jeff Greenhaw, a rural police chief, responded to a hysterical call from a woman who'd said she'd seen an alien. Greenhaw drove to the remote area and found his way blocked by a metallic-suited creature standing in the road.
He stopped the car, said, "Howdy, stranger." There was no response, so he got his Polaroid camera from out of the glove compartment and took 4 photographs. The creature then began moving away.
Greenhaw got back into his car and tried to follow the creature, which quickly disappeared. The next day, Greenhaw told his story to the media.
Story came out. First thing that happened is his mobile home was burnt down and the original Polaroids, I believe, were damaged. Fortunately, copies had been made by that time.
Greenhaw's troubles had only begun. In the following weeks, his car engine exploded. His wife left him, and he lost his job.
My speculation is that some government agency was involved in trying to destroy the evidence.
UFO conspiracists lay the blame for Greenhaw's misfortunes on their favorite culprit, the CIA. Others wonder whether Greenhaw's sighting is merely a hoax gone haywire.
I don't think hoaxes go that far. And as to the question has arisen, was he hallucinating? Well, maybe he was, but the camera wasn't.
In 2001, Vice President Dick Cheney was asked about UFOs, responding, "Well, if I had been briefed on it, I'm sure it was probably classified and I couldn't talk about it." For many people, Roswell, New Mexico is the undisputed site of a UFO landing. For more than 50 years, stories have been told of a government cover-up involving a captured flying saucer, alien bodies, and even alien autopsies.
I would say the Roswell crash is the most significant event in human history. We had an encounter, albeit a very sad one, because the creatures were, with the possible exception of one, were dead. We had an encounter with creatures from another world.
The now familiar story of Roswell has only grown in legend since July 5th, 1947, when a mysterious object fell from the sky and landed in a sheep rancher's field. For years, the military maintained its story that the crashed wreckage was nothing more than a weather balloon. But books were written, and witnesses came forward, fueling angry claims that the government was hiding something of momentous importance. Responding to public pressure, the Air Force released a document in 1995 called the Roswell Report, which claimed to tell the truth, that the weather balloon explanation was indeed a cover story, but not for a crashed spacecraft. According to the report, the debris found by the sheep rancher came from a top-secret U.S. military program. Given the code name of Mogul, the military was testing special devices attached to high-altitude balloons as a way to spy on the Soviet Union.
After we used nuclear weapons to end World War II, the American military became very concerned that such weapons could be used against us. And in view of the knowledge of the Soviet espionage, there was great concern in monitoring the development of the Soviet nuclear weapons. As a result, there was very great pressure to get some detection system going.
According to the report, Project Mogul, based 100 miles southwest of Roswell, sent aloft a highly classified device ringed with sensitive microphones attached to a 600-foot-long string of helium balloons. This top-secret payload could acoustically detect atomic explosions even from the other side of the world. The bizarre materials used could easily have mystified a civilian observer, appearing like shiny silver jellyfish in the sky. According to the report, on June 4, 1947, the tracking signal of one of the balloons was lost, and the balloon crashed into the sheep farmer's ranch. The government had provided an explanation for one Roswell mystery, but the report did not make any attempt to explain why many eyewitnesses claimed to see aliens at the site. Descriptions shared many of the same characteristics.
We're generally looking at creatures with very, very short stature, no more than probably 3.5 feet. The four-fingered hand seems to be pretty much a point of agreement. The heads tend to be described as pear-shaped with somewhat larger than usual eyes, with other orifices not very well marked. Not much of a mouth, not much for ears or nose.
Witnesses compared the alien bodies to dummies or dolls, with expressionless, serene looks on their faces. They were dressed in something like a one-piece jumpsuit. To dispel the myth that the government retrieved aliens at the Roswell crash site, the Air Force issued a second document called the Roswell Report, Case Closed, in 1997. This report detailed another secret program, Project High Dive, conducted by the Air Force between 1954 and 1959. High Dive tested a revolutionary parachute that operated at extremely high altitudes. Too dangerous for humans, the first chutes were tested on anthropomorphic dummies, dressed in standard Air Force one-piece flight suits.
We had anthropomorphic dummies that we instrumented, and we could send these dummies to high altitude on single balloons, and with a command signal could separate the balloon from the dummy and let it free fall and open a parachute at some altitude just to see what data we could gather.
The balloons carrying the dummies were launched from the desert near Holloman Air Force Base in southeast New Mexico. Although none were launched from Roswell, many dummies landed and were recovered close to Roswell.
We would send over the helicopter and recovery crews with a number of body bags and pack them in the body bags as soon as we got there.
One witness described an alien body as cold to the touch. This was entirely appropriate, since the dummies plunged from the stratosphere, where they had been subjected to sub-zero temperatures. On impact, they were still freezing, even as they lay on the desert floor. But conspiracy theorists are not at all convinced that crash dummies explained alien sightings around Roswell.
First of all, the crash dummies are around 6 feet tall. And compared to these little guys we're talking about, these little 3.5 foot lithe, thin, very, very small figures, I really can't see how anybody could make that mistake.
Also, the dummy experiments began in 1954, 7 years after the alleged Roswell crash. Even those who support the Air Force's explanations are not entirely convinced.
I think it's just the Air Force's attempt
to provide some meat here to the story to explain it. What else could these aliens be? For most skeptics, they're entirely up here. Either they're making it up, or they're just fantasy-prone personalities. They think they saw something. Did they see crash dummies? Maybe.
Despite the Air Force's vigorous assertions, the dummies' explanation still cannot explain the most perplexing of all Roswell legends, a gruesome and astonishing account of an alien autopsy. The Air Force's 1997 document, Roswell Case Closed, offered rational explanations for how military test dummies were mistaken for injured aliens. But it did not explain an encounter held by conspiracy theorists to be the single most convincing proof that aliens did crash in Roswell. The witness was Glenn Dennis, a mortician in Roswell in 1947. Dennis claimed that on July 6, 1947, while driving an injured airman to the hospital at Walker Air Force Base just outside Roswell, he saw 3 ambulances, one with bizarre debris inside.
It looked more like maybe what fiberglass would look like today. It was very thin. There was a piece that kind of looked like the end of a canoe. It was coming up like this.
Dennis then encountered a nurse named Naomi Maria Self, who was highly agitated. She told him to leave immediately.
He was in the process of leaving, and these people accosted him and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I came out here on business, you know." And they said, "Well, you're not supposed to be here." And in fact, he ended up being dealt out that famous threat, if you don't get out of here and you don't keep quiet, they're going to be picking your bones out of the sand.
Dennis says this vicious threat was delivered by an angry red-headed captain. Dennis left, but returned the next day to meet with the nurse. This time, she told him of an incredible alien autopsy conducted inside the hospital.
She said, "You won't believe this." She said they had done these crash bags that were laying on this iron gurney. It was 2 very mutilated, she said, very, very small bodies. Some of them looked like they were almost black.
After his conversation with the nurse, Dennis would never see her again.
She was shipped out that afternoon after 3 o'clock. One of the nurse officers that I knew called me and said that your friend had just been transferred out.
The Air Force argues that Dennis's amazing story may be nothing more than a confused mix of details from 2 military accidents that occurred near Roswell. The first accident happened in 1956 when an Air Force aircraft crashed into the desert outside Roswell, killing 11 crew members. The black, mangled bodies of the crew were taken for autopsy to Walker Air Force Base. The body bags were then sent to the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, where proper refrigeration was available. Dennis, an employee of the funeral home, may have seen the bodies placed here in cold storage. As for the nurse, government records show there was never anyone named Naomi Maria Self stationed at Walker Air Force Base, and no one by that name ever served in the Air Force. And what of the angry red-headed captain? This detail of Dennis's account may be explained by a top-secret Air Force training accident in 1959, involving 3 pilots testing special high-altitude parachutes. The injured pilots were taken to the hospital at Walker Air Force Base, where test pilot Joe Kittinger desperately tried to keep the secret project from becoming public knowledge.
Pro-alien Roswell writers talk about this red-headed captain, which was Joe Kittinger, talking to some of the people there and making even vicious threats toward them and even their families if they divulge what had happened. What the real story was that he had asked them very politely, "Please don't say anything about this balloon accident because I have forthcoming programs that could be compromised if too many people learned about this accident."
The Air Force believes that Glenn Dennis's memory of 2 events may have evolved into this tale of an alien autopsy and military cover-up.
In psychology, we call this confabulation, where you're mixing real memories, with your own interpretations of them, with fantasies that you've added to it, with other people's accounts of what they think they saw, and all that becomes a genuine memory for you, but it doesn't really exist anywhere else other than this one person's mind, then that becomes the star eyewitness account in this Roswell incident, when in fact it doesn't really represent anything at all.
After the alleged crash at Roswell in 1947, residents of New Mexico described silver discs zipping through the air. These sightings of flying saucers in the skies continued into the 1970s. Between 1966 and 1972, the balloon unit at Holloman Air Force Base conducted experiments near Roswell with vehicles which actually were spacecraft. But they weren't extraterrestrial. They were space probes for NASA's Viking, Surveyor, and Voyager programs.
We flew a number of disc-shaped objects, and those were seen in the air sometimes as flying saucers. We launched the Viking nose cone with hot rockets on board from Roswell itself. Several of the museums in Roswell, they made copies of the Viking nose cone and said, hey, this is what their spaceship looked like.
The probes, stored on base in hangars, may have spurred tales of a captured flying saucer.
And they kept things kind of locked up so people wouldn't get in there and poke around. But people passing by, maybe through a crack in a hangar door, would occasionally see this thing. And what it was interpreted as was a leftover from the 1947 crash.
But die-hard believers refuse to give up the idea that the government covered up an alien UFO crash at Roswell. They still hope that one day this so-called cover-up will finally be exposed.
I wish we had a piece of debris. We don't. You know, I wish we had a photograph of the crash site before the retrieval. We don't. I wish we had a photograph of the bodies. I wish we had the bodies, you know, but we don't have any of these things. What we have is many hundreds of witnesses.
People still remain firmly divided over the truth about the Roswell incident, which has nevertheless earned its place in history.
I think Roswell will be up in the top 10 of the myths of America in the Cold War as a classic example of a mass hysteria and sort of an urban legend that gets told of the fears and anxieties that Americans had during the Cold War, wrapped around all this new and exciting NASA science fiction culture that we lived in at that time.